it's April, which means it's Earth Month, or at least that Earth Day falls within the month, depending upon who you ask. Either way, for this month's episode, I wanted to explore the history of radical environmentalism. If you're close to my age, it might feel like environmentalism and movements for environmental justice have always been there. But the phrase global warming didn't appear in print until the 70s, and the idea of climate justice, of environmental work in the global north centering the struggles in the global south, is way more recent than that. It might feel like environmentalism is all around us now, but there are people in our movements who remember when things looked quite different, when these ideas were new and actually kind of controversial on the left. The history of how environmentalism and leftism came together is an important one with a lot of surprises and ultimately important lessons for our movement work today. Here to share this rich history with us is Brian Tokar of the Institute for Social Ecology. Brian has the vital perspective of someone who is actually involved in a lot of the movements he talks and writes about. Our conversation digs deeper than the typical mainstream account of environmentalism, giving a sense of what it's actually like to be on the ground and what the essential elements are for a truly radical environmentalism. Whether you're listening when this comes out, on Earth Day itself, or months or years later, I think this episode will stay relevant. If you're feeling the despair, if you're watching the crisis unfold and don't know what to do, if you wonder what happened to the momentum of the past, and if you're trying to carry that energy into the future, keep listening. And let's continue the legacy of environmental radicalism.
I'm Brian Tokar. I use he, him pronouns. I live in central Vermont in the town of East Montpelier, about 10-minute drive from the state capital. And I've been part of the faculty and board of the Institute for Social Ecology for a couple of decades. I've been involved with social ecology for longer than that, going back to the late 1970s. I've taught in environmental studies at the University of Vermont. I'm a labor activist. I'm a climate activist. I've written and edited a number of books on various environmental and social movement topics.
Perfect. So is there a time in your life or a period or a moment you can point to where those interests really kicked off?
Well, I mean, it goes way back. I'm old enough to remember the first wave of widespread interest around environmental issues around the first Earth Day, but didn't really get intensively involved until quite a bit later. Probably the crucial event for me was some anti-nuclear work I was involved with at university. I was a student at MIT in the mid-1970s when the administration cut a secret deal with the government of Iran, which at that point was a client state of the US, to train nuclear engineers for the Shah of Iran. And we discovered this supposedly secret deal and protested against it. And by going as public with it as we did, they eventually had to cut it short halfway through. And about 2 years later, I started hearing about an emerging movement to stop the construction of a nuclear power plant on the coast of New Hampshire in a little town called Seabrook, right on the New Hampshire-Massachusetts border. And that movement, especially in its early years, really embodied a lot of the principles I was inspired by at the time. I had already read a little bit of social ecology. I had met Murray Bookchin as part of an anarchist lecture series group that I was involved with in the Boston area when I was in college. Um, and the anti-nuclear movement really brought together a focus on decentralized direct action, along with uh, a real vision of a different kind of future. Those were the days when talk about renewable energy was pretty new, and it was mostly an activity of people who were more hobbyists than technologists in the conventional sense. And people who were involved in renewable energy at the time really saw the potential for a fundamentally decentralized, community-controlled energy system, and saw that those technologies made such a future much more possible than anything that had come before. So there was a vision of renewable future. There was a focus on direct action. There was a commitment to decentralized grassroots organization. And over time, some of us began to explicitly bring ideas from social ecology, from Murray Bookchin's writing, into that movement. And it just resonated so well with the thinking of people in the movement that it really kind of fit right in. Was really one of the first examples of a movement that at least aspired to be, it didn't always succeed in this respect, that aspired to be governed in a grassroots, decentralized way, with decisions made by small affinity groups and local clusters and councils of spokespeople making decisions at successively wider levels for the movement as a whole.
It sounds like that was pretty new for environmentalism to have those
It was
futures.
really brand new. The idea of organizing by affinity groups had really only been in circulation for a few years then. And of course, it was Murray's postscript to his essay, Listen Marxist, where he first described the model of affinity groups that came from the anarchist movement in Spain in the period leading up to the Spanish Civil War. And the anti-nuclear movement was really the first to try to make that model the core of how it functioned and how it made decisions, both in immediate direct action settings and eventually over the course of a couple of years of development to make it the structure of the movement itself. And of course, that model was revived many years later in the global justice movement around the so-called Battle of Seattle and then around Occupy. But the anti-nuclear movement in the 1970s and 80s was in many ways where it all began. And during those years, I was really immersed in the mainstream science world. I was, by the late 70s, I was in a PhD program studying biophysics and neurophysiology, but also coming up here to Vermont a couple of weeks every year to sit in on some of the classes that were happening in what was then the beginnings of the Institute for Social Ecology. And I would, in exchange for getting to visit for a few days, I would present on what was happening in the movement down in Boston, where I was living at the time. But after a few years, it really became clear that the ideas I was engaging with and talking and reading about during my couple of weeks here in Vermont every summer were just a whole lot more meaningful and a whole lot more relevant to the things that really mattered in the world than what I was doing in dingy laboratories the other 49 or 50 weeks out of the year. And eventually, left mainstream academia. I took an ABD master's because I'd finished all my coursework and exams, and came up to Vermont and moved to Burlington and joined a study group with Murray Bookchin in his living room. And a few years later, got involved with the Institute, and also got enlisted by a friend of a friend of a friend out in Southern California to write one of the first books on green politics that focused on the potential for the emergence of a green politics in the US. So, I thought I might be a writer someday, but by the time I was 30, I was actively working on a book that was really used as an organizing tool by people forming local green chapters all around the country. This was before there was anything like a Green Party in formation, or people running for president and all that nonsense. As Greens, it was in those days, the vision was that there would be again, a grassroots network of activists that were sometimes engaged in running for local office, which is something that, as you know, Murray Bookchin was very much in favor of, and got into a lot of trouble with more traditional anarchists for taking that position. So there was no inconsistency between doing some local electoral work and being primarily a grassroots movement-centered project. Of course, that didn't last very long, but in the early years of the Greens, my book in the US, my book became one of the main readings that people started with when they were first getting involved with the movement. And I got to do some traveling around and talking about that. And also eventually, after a few years in Burlington, moved over to the east side of the Green Mountains, where the Institute is based, and started to get more involved in the organization itself. And eventually started working with graduate students in social ecology when we had a year-round program through Goddard College, which is a progressive college here in central Vermont, which is really where the Institute was first founded by Dan Chodikoff and Murray Bookchin in the mid-70s. And so I started teaching in that program, and then in the ISC summer program, and many phases of the evolution of our educational program since then. I also got to teach, as I think I mentioned, at the University of Vermont for about 15 years in their environmental program, which in its heyday was very interdisciplinary and very open to radical ideas, even though most of the faculty didn't see themselves as radicals at all. They were open to it, and it was kind of a magnet for activist-oriented students, which eventually led the administration to decide that the program was way too unwieldy and functionally dismantle it, which they did during the height of COVID, and classic act of disaster capitalism, destroying a successful and popular program during the time when nobody could really meet and organize and prevent it from happening. So my time of teaching at UVM ended about a year ago.
So I want to talk a little bit about social ecology, just sort of to frame things before we jump into some of the radical history. I know it's probably not super easy to give an elevator pitch, but if anyone could, it would be an ISC faculty member.
It is challenging because it's very wide-ranging outlook, but social ecology is basically an approach to understanding the evolution of the relationships between human communities and the rest of the natural world. It's rooted in an understanding that the environmental problems that we face today are fundamentally social and political in nature, and that they have roots in a long legacy of emerging patterns of domination within society. So there's critical dimension, there's an anthropological and historical dimension, there's a philosophical dimension looking at the emergence of human consciousness from the natural world and the potential to fully realize our capacity to be fully conscious, fully rational, and fully free as humans, and to do it in a cooperative manner, both among ourselves and in terms of our relationships with all of non-human nature. It's also a political strategy rooted again in decentralized direct democracy, reclaiming power from the ruling institutions, both economic and political, that dominate our world, and bringing power back into the communities where people can make decisions about everything that's important in our lives. It's also a long-range utopian vision for reharmonization between or among humans and between, again, our own communities and the rest of nature. So social ecology is very wide-ranging in both theory and praxis. We've been involved in supporting all kinds of movements for change ever since the earliest years of environmental activism in the 1970s, right up through all of the other movements that I mentioned earlier.
So I see social ecology, it feels like kind of an inflection point for environmentalism where it's got these Marxist roots, it's got these anarchist roots, it's got these green roots that all kind of come together. It's like a synthesis of the politics and the ecology that, at least from my understanding, it wasn't as present in movements and ecological perspectives before. Would that be fair to say?
It certainly wasn't. I mean, the idea that the ecological crisis is rooted in the dynamics of capitalism, the imperative to grow and expand and accumulate, is something that some more traditional environmentalists began to speculate about in the early 1960s. But the Marxist left was really pretty uninterested in ecology and sometimes overtly hostile to it. People were still very much influenced by the developmentalist mentality that prevailed through the era of the Soviet Union, trying to outcompete capitalism.
Mm.
And in some ways they succeeded, but in ways that were really destructive of any elements of a genuinely reconstructive vision in that sector of the left. And of course, Murray Bookchin emerged out of the Marxist left, rejected Stalinism when he was 18 years old, started after World War II, becoming engaged in circles of thinkers who were beginning to ask whether we can, with the failure and co-optation of the workers' movement, which was of course seen as the locus of revolutionary politics for, since the mid 19th century, with increasing co-optation of the labor movement, trying to articulate a politics rooted more in communities than in the workplace. And then by really the late 1950s, Murray came to the conclusion that the contradictions of capitalism that Marxists were focused on were unlikely to really bring the system down, but the ecological contradictions that were emerging, that were increasingly of concern to people in the US and around the world, maybe did have the potential to fundamentally undermine capitalism.
That's really interesting. What are those contradictions?
Well, I mean, this was the era of unregulated industrial expansion, the post-World War II era, where rates of consumption increased many, many fold, partly drawing on the excess productive capacity that was created to fight World War II, the creation of the consumer economy, and what some environmental historians call the period of the Great Acceleration, where the pace of consumption and resource extraction increased at an unprecedented pace during the late 1940s and early 50s. So the environmental contradictions became very clear. And of course, by the mid 1960s, smog in major cities in the US was so severe that people were having serious respiratory problems. Water pollution with the increase in industrial output during that period was a serious problem. By the late 60s, there were incidents like major oil spills off the coast of Southern California, people suffocating in the streets of major cities, the famous incident of the Cuyahoga River outside Cleveland catching fire because there was such a high concentration of oil-based chemicals in the river. And these all helped spark an awareness of the severity of environmental problems. Remember, until the 1970s, the pollution was very much unregulated. And even some corporate types were starting to worry about impending resource scarcities.
Right.
So there started to be activism around these issues. There started to be rulemaking and legislation and regulation coming from the local and state levels, major lawsuits against huge polluters. And by the end of the 60s, the powers that be decided that they would rather have environmental regulation at the national level than to continue to have to put up with increasingly stringent rules being imposed locally in so many places. People aren't aware of this. People say, oh, well, Nixon was president and we got all these environmental laws as if he had some revelation. Nixon never stopped being a racist, reactionary warmonger. But Nixon thought he could play off the environmentalists against the anti-war movement. That, some concessions around environmental issues might help diffuse some of the intensity of the opposition to the Vietnam War. That was another ulterior motive. But the main one was the fear of increased pressure to regulate industry, regulate pollution from the local level. And I think that's an important lesson for climate activists today, one that is not talked about anywhere near often enough.
So I'm excited to get to tactics and strategy. I think to get there, I want to get sort of, gosh, I know it's a big ask, but an overview of how we've gotten to where we are today with radical environmentalism, some of the trends. And I want to start with a methodological question, which, I'm sort of wondering how we read or approach radical history. If there are sources you can suggest, or what is out there to be gained for us as students of history that are wanting to use that history to influence our movements?
Interesting question. I mean, having lived through a lot of the history that I write and talk about, it's sometimes hard to take a step back and understand how to think about it in terms of a systematic methodology. I mean, at various points I've sought out sources of writing that helped explain what was going on at the time. And, if you're a participant in various movements, I think it's a little bit easier to discern whose versions of history and what bodies of ideas meaningfully reflect the events of the time and which ones don't. And a lot of environmental history that we run across is focused very narrowly on the history of legislation, for example, which is important to understand, but they rarely talk about what was going on in society that spurred changes in legislation. So, who are the writers who are in touch with the movements on the ground and talking to the people who are really engaged in making change? I think that's one important criterion. And then what are the bodies of ideas and theory that meaningfully help us understand what's happening? And that's one of the factors that drew me to social ecology early on, because it just had tremendous power to help me understand, to make some sense out of this crazy world that we live in. I mean, I came of age as a radical and actually began first became a college student in the year when the 60s New Left had just completely fallen apart. The war in Vietnam was still raging, but the organizations that were at the center of the movement that were also in touch with notions of how to build toward a different kind of world were co-opted, were crushed, were taken over by various sectarian groups. And it was Murray Bookchin's writing and also the writing of people like Noam Chomsky that really helped me understand that there was a long history of much more liberatory outlooks than the kind of narrow sectarian politics that emerged out of the dissolution of the 60s New Left. So that's a little bit convoluted, but I hope it helps.
Oh, definitely, yeah. So with that in mind, environmentalism has a very interesting history because it's not necessarily radical. It hasn't always been radical. It has a frankly reactionary and racist background. And I'd love to just sort of step through, like what the continuity is there and what makes radical environmentalism radical. And, considering that for a long time the left was very afraid of these awful reactionary tendencies in what was considered environmentalism at the time.
Well, I don't know that they were aware of the reactionary tendencies that we know about now, and I'll say more about that in a bit. It's just that the left was productivist, the left was Promethean, the left believed in the power of technology on the part of nominally socialist countries to defeat the militarism and economic superiority of the capitalist world. So most of the groups that were concerned about environmental issues in the early 20th century were very elitist. They came out of upper class hunting and hiking clubs that really didn't have anything remotely like a radical politics. And of course, what we mean by radical politics goes back to the origins of the English word radical, which is the Latin radix, which is a root, same word that we get radish from. And true radicalism looks at the underlying roots of the problems that we're facing and the systemic nature of those problems. In the post-World War II period, there emerged a number of corporate-funded think tanks concerned about issues like potential resource scarcity, and that sort of thing. But there were also environmental scientists in the early 60s who started raising the question of whether there might be something radical about the science that they were doing, that by looking at the patterns of the living world in a holistic way, there needed to be, that in order to do that, one needed to be critical of the patterns of out of control economic growth that were the norm in the 1950s and 60s. And even some environmental scientists started to ask, is there something subversive about this science that we're doing? That, for example, tends to marginalize it in academia. When I was studying biology and biophysics in the 1970s, it was considered just out of step with the times to be interested in anything bigger than cells and molecules. It was an extremely reductionist period in the biological sciences, and the ecologists were, of course, rubbing up against that and wondering why it is that they weren't being taken more seriously. Was there something subversive there? And then it was Murray Bookchin who came along in 1965 and wrote his famous essay, Ecology and Revolutionary Thought, saying, yes, ecology is fundamentally radical and revolutionary and reconstructive, and that it goes much further than the prevailing currents on the left in the time in that time. And there were, beginnings of ecological dimensions of various movements in the late 60s. We know about People's Park in Berkeley, and we know about the emergence of back to the land movements in the late 60s and early 1970s in response to the increasing alienation of people living in major cities, and also partly in response to some of the internal chaos in the left and in the anti-war movement as these various more authoritarian and sectarian currents were moving in and taking over. And then with the passage of the environmental laws of the 1970s, the environmental movement quickly became very institutionalized and became part of the system in many ways. But the radical currents continue to exist in parallel. The anti-nuclear movement that I mentioned, I think, being one of the most interesting examples. And then Reagan got elected president in 1980, and there was this huge backlash against environmentalism. And all of the people and organizations that were beginning to find a comfortable home inside the system were all of a sudden being increasingly marginalized. And their response was to really build up some of the more mainstream environmental groups in response to that. And that was the period when the membership of groups like the Sierra Club increased 10 times over.
Wow.
But at the same time, environmentalism was really under attack. There was a real corporate backlash. I mean, Reagan appointed people to positions like the head of the EPA, who was actually the mother of Neil Gorsuch, current right-wing Supreme Court justice, who ended up being indicted for contempt of Congress because she and her people were just trying to shut down the regulatory apparatus that had been created during the 1970s. So there was this tension within the system. But then, it was during that period that a number of new, more radical tendencies began to emerge. We had the radical forest protection movement embodied by the Earth First network, doing direct action and various kinds of monkey wrenching against the destruction of forests. We had the emergence of environmental justice movements of mostly communities of color that were beginning to learn that how much they were singled out for higher levels of exposure to all kinds of environmental toxins. Initially, the focus was on abandoned toxic waste facilities like Love Canal, but quickly evolved beyond that to a much wider understanding of how communities of color are singled out. We had the emergence of anti-developmentalism in many parts of the global South, and writers like Vandana Shiva and Martin Core beginning to articulate what was then called a third world environmentalism. And all these tendencies began to circulate in the 1980s and 90s. The emergence of ecofeminism, trying to get beyond some of the polarization within the women's movement and trying to work toward a more holistic understanding of how the typecasting of those who identify as women as somehow being closer to nature had evolved in parallel with an increasingly disparaging view toward nature in Western culture, and trying to find a third way beyond those dualisms. All those tendencies emerged during that time in the 1980s and early 90s, when environmentalism, which was beginning to be much more established, found itself increasingly under siege. And, I think those are the movements that we really have a lot to learn from, that we spent quite a bit of time talking about in our class. And then increasingly intersectional understandings of the roots of environmental problems as the environmental justice movement became more sophisticated, as the global justice movement emerged in the late 1990s and everything since then. And it was really only in those later periods that people began to go back and investigate the origins of the environmental movement and learn about things like the expropriation of indigenous land to create national parks beginning in the late 19th century, and some of the racism that was built into the structures of the earliest environmental groups. That's a critique that really nobody was talking about until, I don't know, probably the early 2010s.
Oh, wow. My age is showing. So I'd love to talk about where we are today, the state of the environmental movement today, sort of your evaluation of it. To me, I mean, like I just said, the 2010s is sort of just when I started being aware of politics, of ecology in the first place. So to me, it feels like it's always been about international solidarity. It's always been about race. It's always been about climate. But these are all very recent developments. So I'm curious to hear your perspective on where we are today, and I guess what we can learn from, what perspectives you find valuable.
Well, since the middle of the first decade of the 2000s, I've really gone back to focusing primarily on the climate situation. I learned a lot about energy issues and energy politics when I was involved in the anti-nuclear movement 45 years ago. And then in my own work, I shifted in a number of different directions. I worked on toxics issues for a while, even before it was framed as environmental justice. I worked on green politics. I worked on issues around food and GMOs for many years. And then I'm always aware that climate disruptions were looming on the horizon, beginning to manifest in other parts of the world. But here in the global north, people still, as recently as the early 2000s, viewed major climate disruptions as something that we would probably have to deal with at some point in the distant future.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the middle of the first decade of the 2000s, people from indigenous and other land-based peoples movements around the world started showing up at the UN climate conferences and in other public settings saying, this is not about the future. We're dealing with this already. It's been affecting our lives, our ability to thrive, our ability to grow food, our ability to sustain traditional ways of life already. And the climate movement should not be about what might or might not happen in the distant future to all of you in the global north. It's got to be about what's happening to people in the majority world now.
Right.
And some of us really try to bring that message here to movements in the US, starting around 2006, 2007, 2008, and then the lead up to the big UN climate conference in Copenhagen in 2009, which was really the first one to have big demonstrations in the streets that gained the attention of the international press. And then it really just kind of accelerated from there. So the idea of a justice-centered approach to the climate crisis was really an important radicalizing development for the climate movement. And in some ways, the language of climate justice has become very mainstream within the climate movement in recent years. I remember when Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, came out. And it was really the first book to refer to climate justice as if it was something that people were generally familiar with, rather than something new that needed to be explained. That was a big shift. And certainly organizations like a lot of the local and regional 350 groups began to define themselves as climate justice groups, and the idea that we need to understand that the people who are disproportionately affected are the people least responsible for the problem has, over the last 10 years, actually become everyday wisdom in the movement. And that's a huge step forward. Of course, the COVID pandemic intervened, and a lot of street actions that were gearing up throughout the 2010s all of a sudden got cut short. And I think a lot of people are still struggling to figure out how to get some of that momentum back. And meanwhile, the climate situation has become so much more extreme, and there's no longer anybody in the world who isn't directly affected in serious ways. And you know, at the UN level, we see the powers that be still manipulating behind the scenes to stop people from talking about banning fossil fuels, which the scientists are very clear is an absolute necessity. You know, the pace of new fossil fuel development in places like the US and Russia and China and India over the last couple of years has just continued to grow. And it's completely intolerable. It's not consistent with what we know is necessary for the world to continue to thrive as it has for all of human history.
Right.
It's a much more extreme situation than anybody thought we would be facing this soon.
Yeah, that's for sure. It sounds like big progress that we've got this, general sense among most of us, and sometimes it doesn't feel like most of us, but if you look at polling, it is most of us that are concerned about climate. Um, there's, this general sense that this is a problem that needs to be seriously dealt with. We need resources put towards it. The people most affected are those who have contributed the least to it. But is that sense of climate justice enough? What do we need, and what's it going to take to actually, it's one thing to identify the problem, and there's been great strides there, but what does it take to deal with it, and how can we how can we learn from the history of the movement?
Yeah, well, I mean, in theoretical terms, we know from social ecology that justice discourse is never enough. If we look at the emergence of language around justice, we understand that it emerged during a time of increasing unfreedom
Mm,
in many areas of the world and rising patterns of domination and hierarchy and control, and that it was a necessary response to uh, rising forces of domination and control. But justice discourse often falls short of a fully radically liberatory outlook on that's rooted in a broader understanding of human and natural potentialities. And we need to go much further. And we need to talk about a completely liberated society that is not just fighting the good fight, but that's capable of getting beyond the sometimes overwhelming constraints imposed by this incredibly destructive and antisocial and anti-ecological system that we've lived under for so long.
right.
And there are certainly sectors of the climate movement that uh, are explicitly anti-capitalist. We have the System Change, Not Climate Change network, and people using that slogan in various parts of the world. But right now, with the kinds of disruptions we've been living with, it's really hard to sustain that visionary focus on long-range possibilities that was so exciting in the heyday of the anti-nuclear movement, that's been such an important part of what's helped many people get beyond the trap of climate despair. And it makes it hard to sustain the utopian dimension of the movement that's so central to social ecology's understanding of the ways forward.
Mm,
And on one level, we need to do it anyway. We know a renewable energy system is feasible. We know it's cheaper. We know it's, for all the problems that we still need to solve around mining and extractivism for mega scale renewable energy projects, which are a problem. The comparison with the fossil fuel industry is a pretty clear one.
right.
But we also know that private capital is just not that interested, because fossil fuels are one of the most profitable industries ever. And they really, as we know from Andreas Malm's work, set the stage for the capitalist myth of unlimited growth in the economy. And they're fundamental to what makes the system work and what makes the system what it is. So we need to really, at the same time that we focus on the specific manifestations, we really do need a movement that can go after the system as a whole. And it's one thing to say that and to do that in principle and to do that in our language and in our own movement cultures, but to actually be able to break the strength stranglehold that capitalism has over how we live our lives is something we haven't really figured out how to do yet. And the urgency of doing that is greater than ever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one source of hope are certainly the various mutual aid networks, some very radical in their outlook that emerged out of the COVID pandemic and that are continuing to thrive in response to various climate-related disasters, the floods, the wildfires that people are experiencing in so many communities and so many places. So that's one crucially important source of hope. Disaster capitalism likes to keep people divided, likes to draw on people's fears and insecurities to strengthen the power of ruling institutions and people's dependence on capitalism and the state. And the politics of mutual aid can help overturn that, help people see that as communities, we can respond much more effectively and much more resiliently than through established institutions. But that's one step, and it still doesn't break the hegemony of the system. It still doesn't get in the way of the international meetings at the UN level that are supposed to be setting the way forward for climate policy being controlled by fossil fuel corporations, like we saw more blatantly than ever this year.
Yeah.
The tasks ahead are pretty daunting, but we've got to keep our eyes on the prize. We've got to learn from the evolution and legacy of movements before us that have also done amazing radical things in the face of really grim realities. There are still reasons to hold on to the utopian impulse that enables us to see that there's a world beyond the constraints of this system and a world beyond the horrors that we often find ourselves dealing with today, whether it's climate disasters or the war in Gaza or any number of other problems that seem incredibly daunting. We know movements have faced overwhelming odds in the past, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes found ways to prevail and found ways to continue to fight for a better world no matter what. And that's what we've got to be doing now.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I just want to ask this personally. Do you believe that a better future is possible?
I think it's possible. It's definitely possible. I don't know if we're going to get there. I certainly don't know if we're going to get there within my lifetime. But we know that people are capable of organizing themselves collectively and cooperatively, that there are communally oriented, deeply ingrained cultural patterns in literally every corner of the world. We have ours in the West, but people in even in remote reaches of the global South have cultural traditions of cooperation and communally oriented ways of living that we can get inspiration from, and that can help keep reminding us that a better future is possible. I always try to let folks know about this amazing book I got to contribute to a few years ago called Pluriverse, the post-development dictionary, edited by a collective of writers from literally every continent on Earth. including some well-known people like the radical anthropologist Arturo Escobar and the ecofeminist Ariel Sala and Ashish Kothari from India. And they put together this book that has about 100 short chapters, people describing their alternative worldviews from their cultural perspectives, which are different and which are also astoundingly resonant and similar. And Arturo Escobar says instead of scaling up our movements, we can radiate horizontalism outwardly from many diverse centers in different parts of the world and really begin to realize the vision of a movement of movements that can help us get to a very different place than where we are now.
Great. So before we close out, I want to speak briefly to the sense of pessimism and nihilism that seems so prevalent right now. Is there anything that you can maybe say to people who are feeling like there's nothing that can be done? And if you also want to talk a bit about climate pessimism as a phenomenon, where it comes from, and how you think we can move beyond it, that would be great.
I would say two things. First, we know from climate science that what we do now makes a tremendous difference. James Hansen, the great climatologist who used to work for NASA, said in a paper about 10 years ago that our ability to change things now could determine whether we live with decades of climate disruption or centuries or millennia of the kind of increasing climate instability that we're just beginning to see right now. And what we do now really is what's going to determine if we can get back to a more stable state in a reasonable amount of time or not. So, number one, we have to get beyond our despair for our descendants to have any possibility of a livable world to thrive in. And then secondly, as I've been saying all along, we can look at the legacy of past social movements for an understanding of how people have worked against all odds and made really dramatic changes in their lives and in the institutions that we live with. Again, looking at the legacy of historical movements is a crucial way to help us get beyond despair and think about how things can be better. I mean, the system thrives on despair and fear and disempowerment. And when people refuse to succumb to that and continue to fight for a better world, we know that a better world really is possible.
So on that note, I'm going to ask you, what does utopia look like to you?
What does utopia look like? You know, there's a long history of people making prescriptions, people making blueprints, and certainly the legacy of utopian literature going back to Thomas More, going back to William Morris in the late 19th century, utopian writings of the 1960s and 70s era give us clues. And, you know, there are some common threads we can draw on. You know, utopia looks like communities of people empowered to control their lives. It involves patterns of harmonious living among people and with all of the natural world. We know we have the means to do that. We know we have the means to thrive in a symbiotic relationship with all of life. And utopia is about actualizing those underlying potentialities that our knowledge of history, our knowledge of natural history, our knowledge of how people have for millennia lived well on this earth, they all point toward aspects of what a better world can look like. And I don't know that I have a blueprint, but I have images and ideas that that I draw on. I also have my experiences of being in the garden and planting food and working with people in my community and various other communities that reinforce my confidence that the world that most people would prefer to live in is one that's much more cooperative, much more peaceful, and much more symbiotic than what the powers that be would have us believe is necessary.
Solarpunk Now is written, hosted, and produced by me, Luca Dowell. The Solarpunk theme song is by Red Keener on SoundCloud. My guest today was Brian Tokar of the Institute for Social Ecology. If you want to learn more from Brian, or take classes on social ecology, theories of fascism, solarpunk aesthetics, and more, visit the Institute at social-ecology.org. You can follow me on Twitter at SolarpunkCast, Mastodon at SolarpunkCast at spore.social, or visit solarpunkcast.net for all episodes, including show notes. You can also visit solarpunkcast.net to donate to the show. Running a podcast takes time and money, and I do all of this myself, so your support is greatly appreciated. That's solarpunkcast.net, link in the description. And remember, the realization of any vision requires action. I strongly encourage you to get involved with local organizations whose goals align with the brighter future you want to see. Analysis is important, but we have to back it up with practice. Keep dreaming big, and keep up the good work.